Hi, everyone, and welcome to our weekly Chance Talk conversation with Sam Savage. And today we're covering the last excuse in the list of 10 top lame excuses for quantifying uncertainty created by Sam Savage and Doug Hubbard. So we're up to number one. But before we start talking about that, remember that this is a live session. If you're watching on YouTube or LinkedIn, if you're watching on YouTube, do subscribe to the Risk Academy YouTube channel. If you're watching on LinkedIn, say hello, say hi, where you're watching from, and don't feel threatened asking questions. Interact with us. This is the beauty of live sessions. We can actually respond to your questions and take conversation on all different tangents. So, Sam, last excuse. We've covered 10. That means there are 10 recordings on the Risk Academy YouTube channel for people to rewatch, and hundreds of people already watched and rewatched the previous sessions. What are your thoughts on the final one?
Well, before we get to it, let me hasten to say that, um, thinking there are only 10 is ridiculous. I've been in conversations with John Button of Gartner, and we will shortly be writing up an 11th. And yet, the original 10 are the ones that basically hit Doug and me primarily in our travel. So let's look at this one. So I don't have enough data, so I'm just going with a single best guess number, right? And Doug's response is, you have more data than you think, and you need less data than you think to estimate pretty good probability distributions. Now, this is particularly true with a meta log, by the way. And Doug does a beautiful example where, suppose you only have 5 data points. I want to know what a rhinoceros weighs. I've only weighed 5 rhinoceri, or whatever how you pronounce it, rhinoceroses. Right? Well, the chance is extremely high that within those 5, you have the median weight of the rhinoceros. And now I'm just shooting from the hip here because I forget the analysis, but it's like,
Yeah, it was marbles. I think 5 marbles in the bag or something.
No, I mean, here the problem is that what's the chance that the 50th percentile could be to one side of those 5 numbers, and that's something like 1 and 2 to the 5th, right? 2, 4, 8, 16. That's like 1 chance in 32, I think. And don't quote me on this. Go look up Doug's argument, but it's something like that. So people don't bother looking for the data, right? They just don't take into account what they have. So that's ridiculous. Now, my response is not using probability because of a lack of data is like not doing yoga because you're too stiff, right? Or not taking a shower because you're too dirty, or not using a parachute because the wing of your plane is on fire. It's when you don't have data that you need to use probabilities, and use them approximately and roughly if you need to. Just say, what if it were this? What if it were that?
I have 3 points on that. So first, what I discovered, and we kind of briefly touched on that in the previous videos. What I've discovered is when I would start approaching a problem and kind of start sketching out the model, I usually expect that I would need certain types of data points. And then by the end, when I'm finished investigating the kind of the nature of the risk and building the MVP of the model, I often discover that I actually need completely different data points. And so not having enough data assumes that you know what data you need, which is actually not true most of the time. You actually don't even know which data points you will need. to make that decision, and you would be surprised how different the final kind of list of requirements is from the initial list when you just start sketching out the model. So that's a very important point. The second important point is exactly what you said. I use that argument a lot. Is when we have a lot of uncertainty, well, that's exactly the time when you would want to make the ranges wider instead of narrowing it to a single point and just pretending like uncertainty doesn't exist. So it's in fact, I think, kind of good corporate governance for the decision makers to show that they actually know nothing or little about something when they are forecasting or making a decision. And most of the time, if you were honest and showed that the uncertainty is huge, then the decision makers in their right set of mind wouldn't make the decision. They, in fact, would say, we can't make the decision now. You have to investigate and find the data points. And they give you the mandate and the budget for finding the data points. I mean, I'm a little bit surprised how this is still news to most of the businesses, because that's how all of investment works, private equity investment. You get a deal, and there's a lot of uncertainty around the deal. So you pay for due diligence, different. You pay for tax due diligence, financial due diligence, technical market due diligence, to investigate and find the data that is missing to make the decision, because everybody is very cognizant that you can't really invest 50 or 100 million if you don't have enough data. The whole process is designed to collect the data and then make the decision. And the final point, Brian, Pat, and I have been rehearsing for the Risk Awareness Week workshop that me and Brian are doing together. And we're doing like a hypothetical simulation of a risk with mitigation and before mitigation and after mitigation. And there's one assumption that we're making, which is like an effect of mitigation on frequency of certain events. And that assumption is quite fundamental to the final decision. So we take that assumption and then we run a sensitivity analysis. How will the decision change if the assumption changed? Like, what if we got it wrong? What if the assumption was different? And because we were uncertain about it, so what we discovered is that for the case study that we're going to present, basically any value reduction in the risk exposure already makes this decision worthwhile. So you actually don't really care how close you are to the actual effect, because any effect, even minuscule effect, already makes this a worthwhile exercises. And I think you kind of goes back to the point that you mentioned, or I think you're going to show it later with the drunk. If you know something is dead at kind of 99% of the assumptions, you don't really need to get precise. You already know what the conclusion is, and hence your decision is don't walk drunk on the road.
Right. Well, maybe we should let's just take a peek at the drunk for a second. I've got him up on my screen. So again, you've seen this ad nauseum, but someone comes to me, I say, the drunk is wandering around on the road. What do you think his chances are? Who's going to come to me and say, oh, well, what are the distribution of his steps? No one's going to say that. And let's go back to using averages. An average is like a photograph. A simulation is like a video. So suppose, as he's wandering around in the highway, I take my camera and I take a shot very selectively when he happens to be standing up pretty straight right in the middle of the road. And I hand that to you. I say, well, look, he's going to be okay. The point is that if you're using single numbers, you can tell a bunch of little white lies that can convince someone the drunk is going to be alive. Once you see the video of the guy staggering around, right, you know he's dead. And it doesn't matter how drunk he is, really, right? As long as he's staggering, right? So, I think the whole notion of simulating with bad distributions is a great idea, right? It gives you the feeling for what's going on. Now, one other thing I'd like to show along these lines.
Sure. I'll just say hello to Pablo from Chile and Mohammed from United Arab Emirates. Thank you for watching. I can see that there are a lot more people watching, so say hello, ask a question, interact with us.
Great. So the analogy I use in the Flaw of Averages book, I've used this for years, is that Monte Carlo simulation, simulating the uncertainty, right, is like shaking a ladder before you climb on it to paint the side of your house. You bombard it with random forces to see how it reacts. And of course, one of the things you've heard me say before is, well, the distribution of forces when you shake a ladder is not the same as when you climb on it. So it's like garbage in, garbage out. Who's going to bother shaking their ladder? Everybody's going to shake their ladder because you learn so much. You learn so much. And now where it gets tricky and probably the hardest point to get across is when you have multiple uncertainties. This is not as simple as shaking two ladders because the ladders might be interrelated. And the way to think about the interrelationship is like a plank connecting the two ladders. So think about this for a sec. Suppose there's a 10% chance that either ladder will fall over. Well, the chance that both of them fall over is like 10% times 10%. It's 1 in 100. But if the ladders are connected by a plank, then if either falls over, they both fall over. And it goes from 1 in 100 to 1 in 10. So the whole notion of interrelated uncertainties, if understanding uncertainties, simulating that is like shaking a ladder. Well, now what you need to do is shake a whole bunch of ladders connected by planks. And this gets us into the notion of the chief probability officer, who has to understand they're the main, the chief contractor, understanding where all the ladders and scaffolds are and how they're all connected together.
Mm-hmm.
And that I'm really not expecting individuals to easily do that on their own. But we need to start a culture in which people accept the idea.
Yeah. Well, I think to put it slightly differently, I think we need to create a culture where risk managers, that are plenty, start accepting or taking or asking the responsibility for this.
So, the whole give me a number philosophy that, well, I'm too uncertain, so I'll use a single number. For one thing, really before chance calc, what else could you do? You couldn't immediately estimate chances, right? Chance calc, of course, lets you estimate chances, and I hope everyone goes and takes a look at the chance calc add-in. But once you can estimate chances, then I put in the wrong distribution and I start adjusting it. Just imagine putting in something very simple, a meta-log distribution, with a 10th percentile and a 90th percentile. And I don't know what those are. Is it a fat distribution or a narrow distribution? I don't know. But now, when the distribution is this fat, this is uncertain demand, say, okay? Well, if demand is this uncertain, I'm not getting into this business. I can now manually shrink the uncertainty until my spreadsheet says, oh, well, your chances of success are now over 90%. And maybe that's my threshold. Out here, your chances of success are 20%. If we're this small, then it would be 90%. So I remember taking a course in decision analysis from Ron Howard, and an absolute, that not the director, the professor of decision
Yep.
analysis at Stanford, um, an absolute eye opener for me was when I realized you don't have to know the probability. What you want to do is find the critical value of that probability at which your decision would change.
Yeah,
Right?
exactly.
Another analogy I've used over and over.
Yep.
There is a chance that an asteroid is going to hit our house and kill me because I'm in the upper floor, right? Is that chance big enough so that I should run downstairs and, hide under a heavy piece of furniture? No. And I can even tell you how big, well, let's just put it this way. Again, I don't know what it is. But if I knew that within the next few minutes there was a 10% chance of that, trust me, I would be hiding under the sofa, right?
Yep.
At what probability would I? Probably 1 in 100, and not only that, but here's another useful reason, another way to get over this hurdle of uncertainty. So there is a new product. We're uncertain about demand. Everybody has a different opinion on, let's say that what we're worried about the 10th percentile and the 90th percentile. We're worried about those, right? Because that's going to impact. Everyone's got a different opinion. Great. Let's start shrinking this down until everybody says, oh, well, at that point, I definitely do the deal, right?
Yep.
Even though they all have different opinions, you've now found the point at which you would get a unanimous decision, right? And that's important because now you've boiled the question down to, oh, how wide is that uncertainty?
Yep, exactly. And what can we do to investigate and narrow it? You remind me, because that's exactly what we've done once. We were looking at 20 different options for expanding an iron ore mine. And one of the questions was, and basically one setup was selected as the optimal one. And one of the questions that the CFO and the head of strategy asked, will the choice change if some of the assumptions changed? And then we run multiple simulations and came back saying that the choice will not change unless the price of iron ore will go to like some skyrocket, never seen before
Sure.
value, which really gave a lot of comfort that optimal solution selected right now will stay optimal for a very long time until something just completely dramatic
That's
happens.
right, and that's the way to view this, and it's just so shocking. Well, no, maybe not shocking. We have not had before the SIPMath standard a convenient way to do arithmetic with uncertainty, and so everyone's got. I see this question.
Yeah, it's not really a question. It's just Salem
comment
on LinkedIn is just
to be
making a comment, which I think we agree.
But risk management cultures are all different. It's like people trying to do arithmetic before Hindu Arabic numerals, right? Some are using counting sticks, some are using abacuses, some are using Roman numerals. For me, the basis is having the Hindu Arabic numerals of uncertainty. That is the ultimate goal of the nonprofit, because that way we're all looking at the same thing.
Fadi is making an interesting point.
Yeah, Fadi is saying we need to know the tipping point. And now there is such a thing as a tipping point for a probability. So there is a probability of an asteroid striking my house at which I'm going to run downstairs and hide under the sofa. But there's a more generalized notion of that. which I first heard from my colleague at Cambridge University, Stefan Scholtes. He's really one of the co-founders of probability management. He and Daniel Zweidler of Shell, the three of us, wrote the first article on probability management. And Stefan had a wonderful generalization of that. At what probability do I hide under the sofa? It's for what set of probability distributions do I make one choice versus for another, make another choice, right? And that's a much more difficult problem because, this, it's not a one-dimensional problem anymore, right? But, you could certainly look at something like, let's just take a 3-parameter metalog, right? So probability is one-dimensional. Well, a 3-parameter metalog is 3-dimensional. And you could then map out in 3 space, right? All those 3-parameter metalogs for which you would produce the new product, right? Or launch the new space mission, and all those for which you wouldn't. And that would be an interesting characterization. And the fact is, when Stefan originally asked that question, it was before the metalog. And there's a new use for metalogs. I mean, I sort of come up with a new use for metalogs every day, but that's a nice one because you could do it even more simply. I mean, you could go back to a normal and just say, for what means and standard deviations would you do this, right? That would be a 2-dimensional set that you could see. I think that's a good start. But then, of course, the metalogs could take you much further than that. To skewness, go to four dimensions, you got kurtosis and so
on. That is a really good idea. We can actually graphically illustrate at what is the tipping point. And that's a very powerful message. Again, what we're trying to do is we're trying to support the decision being made with this analysis.
Let's go back to the tipping point for a second, because that is the perfect way to put it. But let's also remember that the tipping point will be different for every member of the board of directors. So what we want, now we need a new word for this, it's the unanimity tipping point. Well, actually, it's the tipping point at which the entire board of directors would go for this. And if it's a single probability, that's very easy. We take suppose we're talking about the probability of success of some risky venture. Well, then, of course, you want that probability to be high. And so then we simply take the maximum of everyone on the board of directors, right? Because I think it's, that is the maximum tipping point, right? Oh, I would do it if it's 50%. Alex wouldn't do it unless it was 75%. And someone else wants 90%. Well, okay, if we need unanimity, we got to go with 90%, right? Now, with the multiple dimensions, it's more complicated. But we still can do that. We find the set for which everyone would make the decision.
Yeah. Mohammed is asking a very real question. I faced that many times. If you don't have the business plan, even though you asked for it several times, how do you proceed with risk analysis? Well, my answer is twofold, and then Sam, you can add to it. My answer is twofold. First, if people don't want you to do risk analysis on a particular thing, they probably have something to hide. So I usually would take a different process. So, for example, like I didn't do a risk assessment on a business plan. I would look into doing risk analysis for some procurement or vendor accreditation or something else. That's the first point. But if you really, really must, I would actually make friends with internal auditors, and then internal auditors would get all sorts of information for me. And if that fails, I would look at last year audited financials and the annual report. Annual report usually provides plenty of information, but I feel your pain. It's not uncommon.
Yes. Well, I will say this, that imagine the the fraud that used to take place before Hindu Arabic numerals, right? Financial accounting firms in now this I'm going to Europe, just so everyone understands. Fibonacci had studied math with the Arabs in Algeria and came home to Europe in 1199 with the Hindu Arabic numerals. And I will tell you that they were even outlawed at one point because you had all these people who were using Roman numerals and other different things to keep their businesses alive, and I'm sure there was a lot of fraud going on. So people were not happy with a transparent solution, right?
They rarely are in business. That's why qualitative risk assessments are so commonplace. Is because there's a lot. It's a lot easier to deceive decision makers and oversight bodies with qualitative risk assessments. With quantitative risk assessments, a lot of things become more transparent. Malcolm is asking a question.
He's telling. Well, wait. I think he's giving us a definition. Malcolm, thank you. So the unanimity tipping point, right? He's saying is the decision criterion under a consensus loss function. So that's a very interesting concept. And Malcolm, did you just make up consensus loss function on the spot, or is that well understood in economics? Because it certainly exists. So I'm waiting for him to answer that question. I got a question back.
Okay.
So, well, so look, but Fadi, in terms of that tipping point, remember, we have to move it until we do get unanimity, right? And so we won't get unanimity until we go to some extreme part of the space. Imagine though it's a two-dimensional space, right? It's the mean of the normally distributed demand, and it's the standard deviation. And so different people are going to have tipping points in different parts. Deirdre McCloskey, that's the answer to the question of where did that come from? Is that Alex, can you Google Deirdre McCloskey? Is that
Yep.
an economist? Look, Doug Hubbard is always talking about the risk aversion
He is an economist.
Yeah.
She is.
Yeah. Of your organization, right? So, in risk management, we have a thing called an exceedance curve. So, I go out in this direction, that's increasing risk, and the probability is coming down and down and down and down and down. Well, you also have a risk aversion curve for management. And it's naive to think of that as a single number, because you really have the whole board of directors. And I think this, loss function is common. So now this is Malcolm. Loss function is a common term. And Deirdre McCloskey wrote about misplaced loss functions in several books about, the misuse of statistics methods. Well, I got to look up Deirdre McCloskey. And Malcolm, by the way, where are you from?
Malcolm is in Miami, Florida.
Great. Thank you for chiming in here. So we don't have, until we start doing quantitative methods, we have no way for the board of directors sitting around to have any idea what's going on, right? And therefore, in theory, the organization should have a risk attitude. But if people don't really know how to measure it, it's a little bit like Yeah, we're worried about radioactivity, but we don't have a Geiger counter, right? I mean, the early nuclear scientists, a lot of them died from cancer because they didn't have Geiger counters. Had no idea of the danger. They just blindly went in and did their experiments. So just even if they're not terribly accurate, having sort of Geiger counters for the chance of events, I think, is a way to get people on the same page and at least start having these discussions.
Yes, I think the first step is appreciating that some of the things that we expect in the future are uncertain. Well, what I found,
Admitting it, I
yes,
mean,
because what I found just completely bizarre into my kind of risk education and risk mind. This just didn't like it just didn't register. People pick an assumption and then believe in it as if it was gospel. They just like, oh, it's gonna be this.
yeah,
And I said, well, why? It wasn't this before. There is no evidence to suggest that it's going to be this in the future. It's just one of possible scenarios. And why would you bet your horse or your cow
right,
on
right.
just one single future scenario? To my
Yeah, yeah.
in my
Well, I
mind,
mean,
that
absolutely.
was weird.
I mean, anchoring is well understood. So I am going to have to get off to my next meeting here pretty soon. Alex, this is always fun. We're planning to have at least one of these a week, and
Yes. Any suggestions, any thoughts from the audience on the next topic? Any particular thing you want us to talk about? Because we're starting. We finished the 10 excuses. That's done. We will
we're going
probably
to move
start
on.
sharing.
We're going to move on to the 11th one with John Button of Gartner.
Yeah.
But John and I've got to get our thoughts. We have to refine it and distill it a little bit, but it's a very clear problem.
Yeah.
Well,
Well, I can name one excuse which I got yesterday in our risk management chat in WhatsApp.
Yeah.
I loved it. So somebody said about for many problems, qualitative heat maps are fine. And I said, well, not according to all the back tests and the research in the area. And I stopped there, hinting that every model is wrong, but you can measure the model error in your
Yeah.
models, and some models are more wrong than others.
Yeah.
Being qualitative heat maps are being kind of wrong most of the time.
Yeah.
And then the lame excuse that I got in return was, but it's very difficult to model detail catastrophic events. I'm like, yes, it is, but it still doesn't discount all the previous things said that the other models are wrong most of the time.
Yeah. But then go out at what tail would you? Where's the tipping point in the tail? Right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
And by the way, there's so much low hanging fruit where people are doing this wrong. I don't want to get into the arguments about the tails if you're not even doing the mean correctly, right? I mean,
exactly.
right. I want to start there just because it's such low hanging fruit.
Yeah. Well, that was the point that I made. I said that well, we just saved 13 million on the body of the distribution. We probably would have saved more on the tail when we got to the tail, and eventually we would. But why not be happy with huge savings today when you can do it without the complexity?
Well, or even understanding. Okay, so where Harry Markowitz in investment portfolios looked at both the mean return and the variance of the return, right? I think it's perfectly healthy, and it's a two-dimensional space, right? Mean and variance and an efficient frontier. I think we could be looking easily with simulation at a mean and some sort of tail risk, right? And keeping both in mind, because when you do a mitigation, you might be mitigating the tail, you might be mitigating the body.
Yep. Which is actually exactly what we did for compliance risks. We actually did like a metrics where we had VAR, which is basically your tail on X and mean on Y. And so yeah, and we took a logarithm of the risk, so it actually showed a very nice line and prioritized the risks. So that was like a fancier fancier heat map.
Well, but we'll have to save VAR for a future conversation because that has been
Yeah,
abused. There's something called CVAR,
yeah,
which is
conditional var.
more. Yeah, it's probably better. But now I have to say goodbye, Alex. Thank you so much.
I'll
See
stick
you next
around and
week.
I'll answer a few questions. Thanks, Sam. I'll see you next week.
Bye bye.
Um, all right, I'm gonna just pick up on the last few points. Objective centric approach. I mean, I only know team. What's team's name? Tim Leach, Tim Leach, who promotes objective centric approach. I don't know what is assumption centric. Yeah, please write. I mean, assumption centric. To me, it's the CIA's assumption check, which is a great tool, which I love. Objective centric. Um, it's a nice concept in theory. I completely dislike the actual methodology that Tim promotes, which I've told him many times about. I don't believe few qualitative assessments create a solid enough model to produce meaningful results. Um, but other than that, it's definitely the right direction to think because you want, and Nassim Taleb calls it X and F of X. Um, X being you can quantify a risk, which is just gives you like a loss exceedance curve, and you can get all sorts of conclusions from that. You can understand what the tail is, what the var is, what the expected, unexpected losses are. That's useful, but it's not as useful as f of x, which is function of risk, where you model the effect risk would have on cash flow or decision or objective, and that is just million times more powerful for decision making. So I'm a big fan of objective centric approach. I just wish math was done properly for it. Mohammed, thank you. Investment risk analysis. Okay, well, I love investment risk analysis because I was a head of risk of quite a few sovereign funds in my life. So that's something, and private equity funds. So I'm quite familiar with that. That's a lovely topic for the next conversation. Um, Khalud, thank you for the suggestion. Let me read that. Risk management maturity model. What is the best approach to measure organizations' risk culture? Sure, I think risk maturity models in general, even though I created at least three, I think risk maturity models are such a waste of time because they give you a false sense of doing something, even though your risk analysis is still risk management one instead of risk management two. But we can talk about it. But if you're interested specifically in risk culture, then I have a very specific kind of 10-point action plan on that. So that would I think would be a good conversation. Um, Make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel, Risk Academy YouTube channel, and follow me and Sam on LinkedIn, and follow probabilitymanagement.org on LinkedIn because we will announce. Yeah, it will be same time next Tuesday, but the link will kind of pop up in a few days. All right. Any other questions, thoughts, any other themes or topics you want us to discuss next week? No. It looks like we've covered everything you want to talk about. Thank you, and I'll see you next week.